Cousin It. This story isn't about the man, Clint Thompson, Buckeye manager and mechanical engineer that worked for P&G back in the 70s and 80s. Instead, this is about the rail thin, barely out of his teens, young Clint Thompson that came to Perry in the mid-1970s and took up with the Ferrell family for a time. He's just a kid, is what Papa told Mama that first time he invited Clint to our home for dinner. He was fresh out of college at Georgia Tech and was living alone in a trailer provided by P&G right across from the main mill entrance. He was obviously lonesome, missing his new wife, who was still away at law school, and also missing his big family from McIntyre, Georgia. He landed in Perry about the same time my older sisters were leaving the nest, and maybe there was a space there for ready to be filled in Mama and Papa's arms. They both took to him in a neighborly yet doting parental kind of way, alongside a healthy dose of awe at his brilliance and a tolerant patience of his Clint-ness. Pop saw him at the mill nearly every day, and Clint often took the opportunity to brag over the wonderful meals he'd had at the Ferrell table. Those compliments landed him more invitations to dinner. We got used to having him around. So when a small house down the street from the Ferrell family on Mangum Close Road came up for sale, he bought it. Now we were neighbors. With Clint came a lot of new activity in the neighborhood. He immediately became friends with everyone on the street. He was always busy doing some kind of project and often needed access to Papa's barn and lifetime collection of tools. Clint was a good borrower, always returning items back to their proper places and sometimes improved. He also brought his own toys to the table. Hello, chainsaws. Since he always walked down to our house, Clint had a way of silently appearing out of nowhere, reminding Papa of the character Cousin It from the Addams Family TV show, the original. The nickname stuck. Cousin It was always welcome in our home, but sometimes Papa'd tell Mama to turn off the kitchen exhaust fan if she didn't want to lure him in for dinner. I was just starting high school when he moved into the neighborhood. Clint was 9 years older than me, so I considered him to be in the category of an adult with a job, but still fun and still young enough to be fun. The man owned a mini bike, and he had a sinkhole out behind his house full of frogs and fish, an Irish setter named Samantha that might as well have been mine, and an old tractor like the one from Green Acres. He could fly an airplane. I had full use of that mini bike within the limits of our yards and rode it so much I beat down deep ruts in both his yard and ours. Some of those ruts are still around, and Rod uses them today as trails. The sinkhole provided the frogs that Clint netted to help me get extra credit in ninth grade biology. Coach Barr told the class, bring your own frogs to class and get extra credit. When I told Clint about this, he was stoked. Being the overachiever that he was, those magic words, extra credit, was all it took. Nothing would do but for him to net those frogs and get me those credits. I was happy to have the assistance, and goodness knows I could always use help with my grades. But it was Clint that got the true buzz from all those extra credits I got from bringing 12 plus bullfrogs to class. Fine frogs, as Coach Barr said. No one had to share specimens that year in our class, and I got an A. My favorite Clint story is the day I like to call my rude awakening. It was his favorite Polly story, too. I've been let loose to drive our Ford Mustang at 15 years of age because, well, it was the 1970s and circumstances required young Polly chauffeur herself. I was a very good and experienced driver at 15, probably better than I am now. I've been tooling around Perry for a few days with no problems. One day I stopped at Lockhart's Pharmacy and the car wouldn't start. Generally, I would have called Papa, but he'd hurt his back a few days prior and was at home laying flat. This was just before my future brother-in-law, Charlie, came onto the scene. So rather than disturb an injured Papa, I decided to call Clint at the mill. He would know what to do. Clint was at Lockhart's in 15 minutes, ready to help. After looking under the hood and trying to crank the car, he looked at the instrument panel and asked me a serious question in that engineered tone he saved for special occasions, like the yellow canoe. He said, "Polly, when's the last time you put gas in this car?" And I caught my head like a perplexed puppy and said, "Gas?" He imitated me doing that for a decade. I can close my eyes right now and see him doing it. He did it better than me. I knew cars burn gas, and I even had an understanding of how an internal combustion engine worked. But I just hadn't realized I had to put the gas in the cars. While I could call on Clint to help in any situation, he could not be depended upon to keep it on the down low with my parents. Clint would bust me in a New York minute. Since Mama worked traveling on occasion and Papa worked shift work, I did some entertaining at our house on school nights when Papa was on 4 to 12. Clint had a hotline out to the Buckeye lab where Papa worked. He'd pass by our house, then call and report on how many vehicles were in our yard, along with makes, models, and probably tag numbers. He was known to be thorough. Mama and Papa welcomed and appreciated Clint's reports about my freewheeling lifestyle. He may have sung like a canary about my goings-ons, as he called it, but he also took up many of his hours teaching me how to play and win at backgammon, chess, how to shoot craps. It's math, he'd say. And he taught me how to drive that old tractor. I could drive anything after learning how to drive that thing. That clutch. Clint joined our family in all kinds of activities and sports. Skiing, scuba diving, and snorkeling, plus gardening, which he called farming. And he took part in many of our meals, ceremonies, and celebrations. Sometime in the late 80s, maybe 1990-ish, Clint left P&G and went to work for a company up in his home state of Georgia. But he kept his little house down the street. He wasn't yet ready to let it go. When I met Rod in 1990, he was living in a little trailer behind Mrs. Dandridge's store near the beach road. It was our little love nest. Early in '92, Miss Dandridge sold the store and adjoining campground. The new owners remodeled, and now it was the new Perry bus station. Nothing against buses or the people that ride them, because we all know I'm no stranger to the bus or stations. But neither one of us wanted to live right behind one, so Rod began looking for a house. He came a hair's breadth from buying a house at Cedar Island in 1992, but didn't want to make the commute from Perry every day. Nothing on the market near town fit the bill, so we just made do in the love nest behind the bus station and waited for something to come along. Then, one evening, after having had dinner at Papa's house, we walked down the road to see Joe Jagner's field of crimson clover, which Shug had stopped and told us was in full bloom. As we walked past Clint's long driveway, ran along a fence line next to an open field, Rod asked, "What's up there?" I said, "Oh, that's Clint's house. It's round like a barrel." And I went on to tell him all about it, how the design was something called an Alpine Villa, a brand of kit house that was popular in the 70s. It was 2 stories, covered in cedar shingles. One side curved like a barrel, the other not so much, and was small at just over 9,900 square feet. It sat in the middle of an oak hammock, surrounded and heavily shaded by live oaks and Spanish moss, so it could only be glimpsed from the road. I felt at home approaching, so we climbed the steps and Rod looked in the windows. He had known Clint for the meal and was aware that he had no plans to return to Perry. So Rod asked me to call him later to see if he was interested in selling. All Rod could see through the windows was the orange shag carpet, so I reached up in the hanging flower pot, the plant long dry, and pulled out the key. Everybody in the neighborhood knew where it was. Rod bought the house in 4.22 acres. We married 18 months later and lived there for 17 years with all the perks and privileges 354 yards down the road that Clint had enjoyed, maybe even more. Rod brought his chainsaws to the table too. The last time I talked to Clint was less than an hour before Papa died in 2009. He had called that afternoon, having heard through the pulp mill grapevine that the end was near for one of the first men to welcome him to Perry, his old friend and neighbor, Warren Ferrell. Clint and I talked and laughed about all the good times, and he did the gas impression over the phone. One of the last things I ever said to Papa was, "Cousin It called." When Mama passed away in 2023, I reached out to Clint, having found his phone number in her address book. She had kept up with him and his wife Nancy through the years, more so than the rest of us, and had even visited at the lake house up in Georgia. But she hadn't been in contact with him for a while. I knew he would want to know of Mama's passing, but I didn't get an answer. I received a call from his wife Nancy later in the day, and after expressing condolences about Mama, she went on to say that I could call Clint back and talk to him, but I should know that he may not respond as I expect because he was in the mid to late stages of early onset Alzheimer's. The talk and laughter we shared back in 2009 was our last conversation. Clint died about a year and a half after Mama in February of 2025. He was 71. This story was about a young man, our neighbor and friend, Clint Thompson, also fondly known as Cousin Ed, and how he became a part of our family for a time. If you'd like to read Clint's full obituary, a better description of the man he became and his life and accomplishments, which are admirable and many, the obituary can be found at the link below, or do a Google search for Clinton Earl Thompson, Milledgeville, Georgia.